Hello and welcome to this lecture series on the rise of political parties. We're going to begin here in part one with looking at George Washington. Now, when we look at George Washington, we have to begin by looking at the general, right? And historically, when we look at the general, we see his military record is not really a stellar one. We could talk about the 7 Years' War, right? His 3 trips in the Ohio River Valley, all 3 of them him being rejected. During the American Revolution, he's going to have a 1776 that is marked by defeat after defeat after defeat across Long Island and into New Jersey and finally into Pennsylvania itself, right? In 1777, we see more of the same. And matter of fact, because of his defeats in 1777 and the loss of Philadelphia, coupled with the success of Horatio Gates at Saratoga, there was actually a plan hatched to try and replace General Washington, to kick him out. It's called the Conway Cabal. The Conway Cabal called for the relieving of General George Washington and replace him with the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates. Now, this ultimately will not come to fruition, and thankfully so, right? Now, in general, Washington, as a general, only had one major victory, and that was at the Battle of Yorktown, right? We could take a look at Trenton and Princeton, but these were raids. They were not military battles. But Yorktown was a substantial military battle, and, well, it was an important one because it was the last battle of the war. Now, when I look at George Washington, I see him as an American Cincinnatus. For those not familiar, Cincinnatus was a former member of the Roman Republican Senate. Right, he had retired to his farm when a consul army had become trapped. He was begged to come back and lead an army to rescue them. And for 16 days, he was given absolute dictatorial powers. He raised an army. He saved the consul army that was trapped. And there was a whole week of celebrations afterwards. And if Cincinnatus had wanted to, he could have just declared himself emperor, and he could have run the Roman Republic from that point forward. He was that popular. But there, at the peak of his popularity and at the peak of his power, he lays that power back down and returns to his farm. I see George Washington much in the same way. After the American Revolutionary War was over, after the victory at Yorktown, there was that 2-year time period when you had the negotiations for the eventual Treaty of Paris. During that time, there was actually a plot that had been hatched to overthrow the Confederate Congress. Right? Remember, we're under the Articles of Confederation at this point. In the winter quarters of Washington in 1782, 1783, his own officer corps, who was tired of not getting paid, tired of the unfulfilled promises of the Continental Congress, had hatched a conspiracy. They were quartering in a place called Newburgh, right? This Newburgh conspiracy, these officers began circulating around letters that denounce the Confederate Congress, began challenging their supremacy of authority, and even suggesting that perhaps the military should overthrow them. And also suggesting that they get together and decide, well, what do we do next, right? Now, think about this for a second. What these men are suggesting is a military coup. Typically, when we think of military coups, we think of, small nations in faraway places like in Africa or maybe in Central America, places like that, right? But it almost happened right here in the United States. Washington caught wind of these letters, and he called a meeting of his officer corps. And he denounced these letters. I mean, he had an opportunity here. Had he had said, I will lead you, his men would have rallied behind him, and the people probably would have too. He was that popular. They would have been okay with him overthrowing the Confederate Congress, right? But that's not what he does. He renounces the letters. He gets his men around him. He opens up a letter to read to them, and for the first time ever, he pulls out a pair of reading glasses and puts them on. Now, he's had these for a while, but his men have never seen him don these things. And he took a look around, and he saw the reaction in the faces of his men, and he picked up on the moment right away. He looked at his men, and he said to them, yes, gentlemen, you will see that I've grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service to my country. And with that one sentence, he ended conspiracy on the spot. In September of 1783, the treaty is signed, and at the peak of his power, George Washington resigned his commission and returned to his farm in Mount Vernon to become just, again, a simple farmer in retirement. Now, as we know, George Washington comes back, right? He's asked to come out of retirement with the formation of the Constitutional Convention. He's asked to be the president of it. And when they were designing that executive branch of the government, of course, they had George Washington in mind of what the model of what this executive would look like would be, right? So it's no surprise that once the Constitution was ratified, that the Electoral College, when it assembled for the very first time, readily voted for George Washington to be their president. Each elector had 2 votes. They were to cast a vote for president, cast a vote for vice president. The winner of the vote would be made president of the United States, and the runner-up would be made vice president after a tallying of all the votes. George Washington wins by collecting every single presidential vote by all the electors. He wins by a unanimous decision, and he's the only president to ever do that. He'll do it twice, both in this election and in his re-election. No other president will ever win a unanimous vote in the Electoral College. George Washington is going to set several precedents as the first president of the United States, and he recognizes this. He'll even say, as the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent, it is devoutly wished upon my part that these precedents be fixed on true principles, right? So some of the things that we still see in place today and some of the things we still see throughout American history, we can see as part of Washington's precedents. For example, he called for a neutral stance in foreign affairs. Not isolationist and not a true neutrality, but basically a neutrality in so far as to avoid getting entangled in other nations' wars. Serving only 2 terms. He's going to be voted in unanimously here the first time, unanimously the second time, even though he wanted to retire. But after the second term, once again, he's going to say, hey, do you want to come back? There was even some suggestion, maybe we make the presidency, we amend the Constitution, make presidency a lifetime appointment. But Washington will say, 8 years is long enough for any man in this position, and once again, the American Cincinnatus, at the peak of his power, is going to lay that power down and go back home to Mount Vernon. Probably a good thing. Had he served a 3rd term, he also would have been the first president to die in office, because he died in 1799, a little bit past halfway through John Adams' term as president, right? The calling of cabinets, the creation of a presidential cabinet and calling on them for advisement. Right? He's realized that the job of the presidency was too big for one man, right? The State of the Union address is mandated by the Constitution, but the inaugural address is something that Washington will be established as one of his precedents, right? And every presidency since has given inaugural addresses, some of them quite memorable, right? Even the term of how to address the president himself. What do you call this guy? Do you call him Your Highness? Do you call him Lord? What do you call him? George Washington decided to keep things simple. You'll just refer to the presidency as Mr. President.